Karen Matthews had always been known for her sharp tongue and quick temper in the small town of Millbrook. At 34, she worked as a customer service manager at the local department store, where her reputation for handling difficult customers had earned her both respect and fear from her colleagues. But nothing in her life had prepared her for the events that would unfold on that crisp autumn morning at Buckingham Palace. The trip to London was supposed to be a celebration. Karen's younger sister Emma had just graduated from nursing school, and their mother had surprised them with a week-long vacation to England. It was their first family trip abroad, and Karen had been looking forward to it for months. She had researched every tourist attraction, booked tours, and even learned a few British phrases to impress the locals. The morning started beautifully. The three women had dressed in their finest clothes, with Karen wearing a bright red blazer she had bought specifically for the occasion. They took the Underground to Westminster and walked through St. James's Park, admiring the autumn leaves and taking countless photos. Emma was particularly excited about seeing the palace, having been fascinated by the royal family since childhood. When they arrived at Buckingham Palace, a crowd had already gathered behind the black iron railings. Tourists from around the world pressed forward, cameras ready, hoping to catch a glimpse of any royal activity. The changing of the guard ceremony wasn't scheduled for another 2 hours, but people were already claiming their spots for the best views. Karen found herself growing increasingly frustrated as more people pushed behind them. A group of teenagers kept bumping into her mother, who was trying to take photos with her new camera. Tour groups with loud guides were blocking their view, and Karen could feel her familiar anger beginning to build. "This is ridiculous," she muttered to Emma, who was trying to calm her down. "We paid good money for this trip, and these people are acting like animals." The situation worsened when a large tour group positioned themselves directly in front of the family. Karen asked them politely to move slightly so her elderly mother could see, but the tour guide ignored her completely. When she asked again, more firmly this time, the guide rolled his eyes and made a dismissive gesture. That's when Karen's temper finally snapped. She pushed through the crowd, her voice rising as she demanded that people show some consideration for others. Her mother tried to pull her back, embarrassed by the scene her daughter was creating. But Karen was beyond reasoning. A royal guard, resplendent in his red uniform and tall black hat, stood motionless at his post near the palace gates. These guards were famous for their discipline and their ability to remain completely still, regardless of what happened around them. Tourists often tried to make them laugh or react, but they maintained their composure with professional dedication. Karen, in her escalating fury about the crowd's rudeness, made a decision that would change everything. She marched directly up to the guard, believing that somehow he could help control the unruly tourists. In her mind, he represented authority and order in the chaos that surrounded them. "Excuse me," she said loudly, standing directly in front of the guard. "Can't you do something about these rude people? They're pushing around elderly tourists and blocking everyone's view." The guard, as expected, remained perfectly still, staring straight ahead without acknowledging her presence. His training required him to ignore all attempts at interaction from the public. Karen's frustration reached a boiling point. She had always believed that when she spoke, people should listen. At work, her authority was rarely questioned, and she was used to getting results when she raised her voice. The guard's complete indifference to her legitimate complaint felt like a personal insult. "I'm talking to you," she shouted, moving even closer to him. "Don't you care that people are being treated badly right in front of your precious palace?" Still, the guard remained motionless. His eyes looked straight ahead, his expression unchanged, his breathing steady and controlled. To Karen, his silence felt like arrogance and disrespect. Emma and their mother had caught up to Karen by now, both trying desperately to pull her away from the guard. They could see that other tourists were starting to stare and point. Some were even taking photos and videos of the American woman yelling at the royal guard. "Karen, please," Emma whispered urgently. "Let's just go somewhere else. There are other places to see the palace from." But Karen was too far gone in her anger to listen to reason. The combination of jet lag, frustration with the crowds, and her natural tendency to demand immediate responses to her complaints had created a perfect storm of poor judgment. She reached out and grabbed the guard's arm, trying to force him to acknowledge her. The moment her hand touched his uniform, she felt the quality of the fabric and realized, somewhere in the back of her mind, that she had crossed a line she shouldn't have crossed. The guard still didn't move, but Karen could sense a subtle change in his posture. Other guards in the distance seemed to become more alert. Tourists nearby stopped their conversations and turned to watch what was happening. "Karen, stop this right now," her mother said firmly, using the tone she had used when Karen was a child. "You're making a scene, and this isn't right." But Karen's anger had taken on a life of its own. She felt humiliated by the guard's continued silence, frustrated by the crowd's rudeness, and overwhelmed by the unfamiliarity of being in a foreign country where the rules seemed different from what she was used to. In that moment of complete loss of control, Karen made the decision that would haunt her for years to come. She leaned forward and, in a bizarre attempt to shock the guard into responding to her, she bit his arm through his uniform sleeve. The reaction was immediate and overwhelming. The guard finally moved, stepping back in surprise. Other guards began moving toward them. Tourists started screaming and pointing. Cameras flashed and phone videos began recording from every direction. Karen stood there for a moment, suddenly realizing the magnitude of what she had just done. The taste of wool and brass buttons lingered in her mouth as the reality of her action hit her like a physical blow. The aftermath of Karen's bite was swift and terrifying. Within seconds, what had been a typical tourist gathering transformed into a scene of controlled chaos. The guard she had bitten, a young man named James Morrison who had been serving for 3 years without incident, stepped back and immediately spoke into his radio with urgent, clipped words. "Code red at Gate 2. Tourist assault on guard. Request immediate backup and security." Karen stood frozen, her hand covering her mouth as if she could somehow take back what she had done. The metallic taste of the guard's uniform buttons mixed with her own shock and disbelief. Around her, tourists were pulling out phones and cameras, some recording the scene while others backed away nervously. Emma grabbed her sister's arm, her nursing training kicking in as she assessed the situation quickly. "We need to leave. Now," she said firmly, but it was already too late. More guards were approaching from different directions, their movements coordinated and purposeful. Karen's mother stood paralyzed with embarrassment and fear. In 62 years of life, she had never been involved in anything remotely like this situation. She had raised her daughters to be respectful and law-abiding, and seeing Karen's behavior was like watching a stranger wearing her daughter's face. "Ma'am, please step away from the guard and place your hands where we can see them," came a firm voice from behind Karen. She turned to see a sergeant approaching, his expression serious but not unkind. He had dealt with tourist incidents before, though nothing quite like this. Karen's hands shook as she raised them. I don't know why I did that," she stammered. "I was just frustrated with the crowds and he wouldn't answer me. And Her voice trailed off as she realized how completely inadequate any explanation would sound. The sergeant looked at Guard Morrison, who had maintained his composure despite the unprecedented situation. "Are you injured, Morrison?" he asked. "No, sir." The uniform took the brunt of it. "Just shocked, sir," Morrison replied, his training helping him respond professionally even though his mind was racing with disbelief about what had just happened. More security personnel arrived, including plainclothes officers who had been monitoring the crowd. They formed a loose circle around Karen and her family, not threatening but clearly establishing control of the situation. Tourists were being asked to move back, creating a larger space around the incident. "I need to ask you to come with us, ma'am," the sergeant said to Karen. "We have procedures to follow when there's been an assault on palace personnel." The word assault hit Karen like a slap. In her mind, she had just acted out in frustration. She hadn't thought of it as assault, though she knew immediately that's exactly what it was. She had put her teeth on another person without permission, and the fact that he was a royal guard made everything infinitely worse. "Are you arresting her?" Emma asked, stepping protectively closer to her sister. "She didn't mean any harm. She's just overwhelmed and made a terrible mistake." The sergeant looked at Emma with sympathy. He could see that this was a family caught in an impossible situation, not hardened criminals. "We need to follow protocol, miss. There will be questioning and paperwork. What happens next will depend on several factors." As they were escorted away from the crowd, Karen caught sight of the tourists still watching and recording. She realized that videos of her biting the royal guard were probably already being uploaded to social media platforms. The thought made her stomach turn with a new kind of dread. They were taken to a small security office within the palace complex. The room was stark and official, with basic furniture and photos of the royal family on the walls. Karen found herself sitting across from Detective Inspector Sarah Williams, a woman in her 40s who specialized in incidents involving tourists and palace security. "Let's start with your name and where you're from," Detective Inspector Williams said, her tone professional but not hostile. "Karen Matthews. I'm from Millbrook, Ohio. This is my sister Emma and my mother. Ruth, we're here on vacation." Karen's voice sounded small and shaky, nothing like her usual confident tone. "Can you tell me what led up to the incident with Guard Morrison?" Karen took a shaky breath and began to explain. She talked about the crowds, her frustration with the rude tourists, her belief that the guard could somehow help manage the situation. As she spoke, she could hear how weak and irrational her reasoning sounded. "I know it sounds crazy," she said, tears beginning to form in her eyes. "I've never done anything like this before. I don't know what came over me. I was just so angry and frustrated, and when he wouldn't even acknowledge that I was speaking to him. The guards are trained not to respond to tourists, Mrs. Matthews. It's a crucial part of their duty. They're not there to manage crowds or solve problems. They're ceremonial guards with very specific responsibilities." Karen nodded miserably. "I understand that now. I didn't think it through. I just reacted." Detective Inspector Williams had seen many tourist incidents, but this was certainly among the more unusual ones. Most problems involved people trying to make guards laugh or touching them for photos. Actual biting was unprecedented in her experience. "What happens now?" Ruth asked quietly. She had been sitting silently, watching her daughter face the consequences of her actions. "There will be charges filed. Assault on a royal guard is taken very seriously. Mrs. Matthews will need to appear in court, and there will likely be media attention because of the nature of the incident." The words hit the family like hammer blows. Charges, court, media attention. What had started as a dream vacation was turning into a nightmare that would follow them home and potentially ruin their lives. Emma, always the practical one, asked about lawyers and legal procedures. Detective Inspector Williams explained that they would need to contact the American Embassy and find legal representation familiar with British law. As the hours passed in questioning and paperwork, Karen began to fully comprehend the scope of what she had done. This wasn't just a moment of bad judgment that would be forgotten. This was an international incident that would have legal consequences, financial costs, and social repercussions that could last for years. She thought about her job back home, her friends, her reputation in Millbrook. She imagined the headlines and the social media posts. She pictured her co-workers watching videos of her biting a royal guard and wondered if she would even have a job to return to. The weight of regret was beginning to settle on her shoulders like a heavy blanket, and she was only just starting to understand how much her life was about to change. By evening, Karen's worst fears about media attention had become reality beyond anything she could have imagined. While she sat in her hotel room with Emma and her mother, trying to process the day's events, her story was spreading across the internet like wildfire. The first video had been posted within minutes of the incident. A teenager from Germany had captured the entire sequence on his phone, from Karen's initial confrontation with the guard, through the moment she bit his arm and the subsequent arrival of security. The video was shaky and the audio was unclear, but the central action was unmistakable. "American tourist bites royal guard at Buckingham Palace." Read the headline on the first major news site to pick up the story. Within hours, it had been shared thousands of times across social media platforms. Emma scrolled through her phone with growing horror, reading comment after comment from strangers around the world, who were weighing in on her sister's behavior. "Typical American tourist," wrote one person. "No respect for other countries." Another comment read, "She should be banned from the UK permanently." The story had caught the attention of major news networks. BBC News ran it as their lead international story, with expert commentators discussing the significance of assaulting a royal guard and the potential legal consequences. American networks picked it up as a human interest story about tourism gone wrong. Karen couldn't bring herself to look at any of the coverage. She sat on the edge of her hotel bed, staring at her hands and trying to understand how 30 seconds of poor judgment had turned her into an international news story. Her phone had been ringing constantly since the afternoon. News producers wanted interviews. Reporters were calling for statements. Her boss from the department store had left 3 increasingly urgent voicemails asking her to call back immediately. "I can't answer it. Karen said, when Emma suggested she should at least talk to her employer. What am I supposed to say? How do I explain this? Ruth sat in the chair by the window, looking older than her years. The stress of the day had taken a visible toll on her. She kept shaking her head and muttering about how she should never have suggested the trip. This isn't your fault, Mom, Emma said gently. Karen made her own choice. We all have to deal with the consequences now. The hotel management had been discreet but firm when they returned that evening. Other guests had recognized Karen from the news coverage and were asking questions. The manager politely suggested that the family might be more comfortable at a different hotel, away from the attention. Late that night, when Emma had finally fallen asleep and Ruth was resting, Karen found herself alone with her thoughts for the first time since the incident. She replayed the moment over and over in her mind, trying to understand what had possessed her to do something so completely out of character. She had always been quick to anger, but she had never been violent. She had handled difficult customers for years without ever laying a hand on anyone. She had raised her voice, certainly, and she had been stern when necessary, but she had never crossed the line into physical aggression. The jet lag, the crowds, the frustration with the rude tourists, none of it seemed like enough of an explanation for what she had done. It felt like she had been watching someone else make that terrible decision. Yet she knew it had been entirely her choice. Her laptop was open on the desk, and despite her earlier resolution to avoid the news coverage, she found herself typing her own name into a search engine. The results were overwhelming. Hundreds of articles, blog posts, and social media discussions about her incident. Some of the coverage was sympathetic, suggesting that tourist stress and cultural misunderstandings could lead to poor decisions. But much of it was harshly critical, portraying her as an example of American entitlement and disrespect for foreign customs. One article particularly stung: "The Ugly American, When Tourism Becomes Assault." The piece analyzed her behavior as part of a broader pattern of American tourists behaving badly abroad, though the writer admitted that biting a royal guard was unprecedented even in that context. She discovered that Guard Morrison had been interviewed briefly by a television news crew. He had been professional and diplomatic, saying only that he was unharmed and that the incident was being handled according to proper procedures. Karen felt a fresh wave of shame as she watched him speak. He seemed so young and decent, and she had violated his personal space and dignity in the most bizarre way possible. The legal realities were becoming clearer as well. Emma had spent the afternoon researching British law and had found a solicitor who specialized in tourist legal issues. The initial consultation would be expensive, and if the case went to trial, the costs could be devastating for their family's finances. More concerning were the potential penalties. Assault charges in the UK could result in fines, community service, or even jail time depending on the circumstances. The fact that the victim was a royal guard would likely be treated as an aggravating factor by the courts. Karen had never even received a speeding ticket back home. The idea of standing trial in a foreign country, possibly facing jail time, seemed surreal and terrifying. Around midnight, she finally worked up the courage to listen to the voicemails from her boss. The first was concerned but supportive, asking if she was okay and if she needed any help. The second was more businesslike, mentioning that corporate headquarters had been asking questions. The third was direct and uncomfortable. The company needed to discuss her employment status, given the public nature of the incident and its potential impact on their business reputation. Karen realized that she might lose her job even before she returned home. The department store prided itself on excellent customer service and community reputation. Having an employee who was internationally famous for biting a royal guard was not the kind of publicity they wanted. She closed the laptop and tried to sleep, but her mind kept racing. Tomorrow they would meet with the solicitor and begin the legal process that would determine her fate. She would have to face whatever consequences awaited her, but tonight she was alone with the full weight of what she had done. For the first time since the incident, Karen allowed herself to cry. She wept for the guard she had wronged, for her family who were suffering because of her actions, for the life she had known that was now forever changed, and for the person she had always believed herself to be but apparently wasn't. The meeting with Solicitor Margaret Thornton took place in a small, cluttered office near the Westminster Magistrates' Court. Thornton was a woman in her 50s with graying hair and kind eyes who had Spent 20 years dealing with tourists who found themselves on the wrong side of British law. I won't sugarcoat this for you. Mrs. Matthews, Thornton said, reviewing the paperwork from the previous day. Assault on a royal guard is treated very seriously by the courts. The Crown Prosecution Service will almost certainly pursue charges, and the media attention makes it unlikely they'll consider dropping the case. Karen sat between Emma and her mother, feeling smaller than she had ever felt in her adult life. The formal legal language made everything seem more real and more frightening. What are we looking at in terms of penalties? Emma asked, taking notes as she had throughout the consultation. Best case scenario, if Mrs. Matthews pleads guilty and shows genuine remorse, we might see a fine and community service. Worst case, given the unique nature of the offense and the international attention, could be up to 6 months in jail. Ruth gasped audibly at the mention of jail time. The idea of her daughter imprisoned in a foreign country was almost too much to bear. There is one factor that might work in our favor, Thornton continued. Guard Morrison has indicated he doesn't wish to press for maximum penalties. He's actually spoken quite sympathetically about the situation, suggesting that Mrs. Matthews seemed overwhelmed rather than malicious. This was the first piece of good news Karen had heard since the incident, but it was overshadowed by everything else she was learning about her situation. The court date is set for next month, Thornton explained. You'll need to remain in the UK until then, which I understand creates additional financial hardship for your family. The cost of extended hotel stays, legal fees, and lost income from missing work was mounting into a financial disaster that would impact the family for years. Emma had already calculated that even if Karen avoided jail time, the total cost of the incident would likely exceed $50,000. After the legal meeting, they returned to their new hotel, a much less expensive place on the outskirts of London where they were less likely to be recognized. Karen had barely spoken during the entire consultation, overwhelmed by the reality of what lay ahead. That afternoon, something unexpected happened. A message arrived at the hotel from Guard Morrison himself, delivered through official channels but written in his own words. Mrs. Matthews, the letter began, I wanted you to know that while what happened was certainly unprecedented and inappropriate, I don't believe you intended real harm. I can see from the news coverage that you and your family are suffering greatly for a moment of poor judgment. I hope the courts will take into account that this appears to be completely out of character for you. Karen read the letter 3 times, tears streaming down her face. The kindness and understanding from the person she had wronged was almost harder to bear than the condemnation. From strangers on the internet, he's a better person than I am, she said to Emma. I violated his personal space and dignity, and he's trying to help me. Emma nodded, recognizing that her sister was finally beginning to truly understand the impact of her actions, beyond just the consequences she would face. The weeks that followed were among the most difficult of Karen's life. She couldn't return to work, couldn't escape the constant reminders of what she had done, and couldn't find peace with herself. The family's savings were being depleted daily by their extended stay in London. She began writing letters to Guard Morrison, to the palace administration, to anyone who would listen, expressing her remorse and trying to make amends. Most went unanswered, but the process of writing them helped her work through her feelings of shame and regret. The media attention gradually died down as other stories took precedence, but the internet had a long memory. Videos of the incident were still being shared and discussed on various platforms. Karen discovered that her name would probably be forever associated with this one terrible moment. During the long weeks of waiting, she spent hours walking around London, trying to understand the city and culture she had disrespected. She visited museums, read about British history, and began to appreciate the traditions and customs that she had so carelessly violated. She learned about the history of the Royal Guard, the discipline and training required for the position, and the deep respect the British people had for these ceremonial protectors. Understanding this context made her actions seem even more inexcusable to herself. One evening, while reading about the psychological aspects of crowd stress and tourist behavior, Karen came across articles about similar incidents, though none quite like hers. She learned about the phenomenon of tourist fatigue and how the stress of unfamiliar environments could lead to poor decision-making. This didn't excuse her behavior, but it helped her understand that she wasn't completely alone in making terrible choices while traveling. The knowledge provided a small measure of comfort during her darkest moments of self-recrimination. Emma had been her constant support throughout the ordeal, handling practical matters and providing emotional strength when Karen couldn't function. But the stress was taking its toll on the entire family. Ruth had developed stress-related health issues that required medical attention, adding to their expenses and worries. "I've destroyed all our lives," Karen said one night after her mother had suffered another anxiety attack. "This was supposed to be a celebration of Emma's graduation, and instead I've turned it into a nightmare." Emma took her sister's hand. "You made a terrible mistake, but we're family. We'll get through this together, but you need to start forgiving yourself at some point, or the guilt will destroy you more than any court judgment could." As the court date approached, Karen found herself preparing not just legally, but emotionally for whatever consequences awaited her. She had accepted that her life would never be the same, that she would always be known for this incident, and that she would spend years making amends for 30 seconds of inexcusable behavior. The person who had bitten the royal guard seemed like a stranger to her now, but she knew she had to take responsibility for that stranger's actions and find a way to build a better future from the ruins of her reputation. The morning of the court hearing arrived with unseasonably cold rain that seemed to match Karen's emotional state. She had barely slept the night before, running through possible scenarios and outcomes in her mind. Margaret Thornton had prepared her as well as possible, but nothing could truly prepare someone for standing trial in a foreign country. Westminster Magistrates Court was an imposing building that made Karen feel even smaller as she approached it with her family and solicitor. Despite the early hour, a small crowd of reporters and photographers had gathered outside. Though the media attention had lessened considerably in the weeks since the incident, Karen had chosen to wear a simple navy blue dress and minimal makeup, hoping to present herself as respectfully and humbly as possible. She kept her head down as they walked through the photographers, saying nothing to the reporters who called out questions. Inside the courthouse, the reality of the British legal system became apparent. The formality and tradition that she had so thoughtlessly violated at Buckingham Palace was on full display here, reminding her once again of the cultural significance of her actions. Magistrate Eleanor Hartwell was a woman in her 60s with silver hair and sharp eyes who had seen countless cases involving tourist misbehavior. She reviewed Karen's file with the practiced efficiency of someone who had been doing this job for decades. "Mrs. Karen Matthews," she began, "you are charged with assault on a royal guard, specifically Guard James Morrison, on the morning of October 15th. How do you plead?" "Guilty, Your Honor," Karen said, her voice barely above a whisper. Margaret Thornton had advised her that pleading guilty and showing genuine remorse was her best strategy for receiving a lighter sentence. The prosecution presented their case efficiently, describing the incident and its impact on palace security protocols. They emphasized that assaulting a royal guard was not just an attack on an individual, but an affront to the crown itself and British traditions. When it came time for the defense, Margaret Thornton painted a picture of a woman overwhelmed by circumstances, suffering from jet lag and tourist stress, who had made a terrible decision that was completely out of character. She presented character references from Karen's employer, friends, and community members back in Ohio. "Mrs. Matthews has no prior criminal record," Thornton explained to the magistrate. "This appears to be an isolated incident of extremely poor judgment rather than a pattern of aggressive behavior. She has expressed deep remorse for her actions and genuine appreciation for British culture and traditions." Then came the moment Karen had been dreading most, when she was asked to address the court directly. She stood slowly, her legs shaking, and looked up at Magistrate Hartwell. "Your Honor," she began, her prepared speech momentarily forgotten as the weight of the moment overwhelmed her. "I cannot adequately express how sorry I am for what I did. There is no excuse for my behavior that day. I violated the personal space and dignity of Guard Morrison. I disrespected British traditions that I should have honored as a guest in your country, and I embarrassed my family and my own country with my actions." She paused, fighting back tears as she continued. "I've spent these weeks learning about the history and significance of the Royal Guard, trying to understand the magnitude of what I did. I know that saying sorry isn't enough, but I want Guard Morrison, the palace, and everyone who was offended by my behavior to know that I am deeply ashamed and committed to making whatever amends I can." Karen sat down, emotionally drained. but feeling that she had finally been able to express the remorse that had been building inside her for weeks. To everyone's surprise, Guard Morrison was present in the courtroom. He had requested permission to make a statement, which was highly unusual but had been granted given the unique circumstances of the case. "Your Honor," Guard Morrison said when called upon, "I appreciate Mrs. Matthews' apology and her obvious remorse. While her actions were completely inappropriate and shocking, I don't believe they came from a place of malice. She seemed overwhelmed and frustrated rather than truly aggressive. I would ask the court to consider that this appears to be a good person who made a very bad decision under stress." His statement was brief but powerful, and Karen felt a fresh wave of gratitude and shame as she realized that the person she had wronged was still showing her more kindness than she deserved. Magistrate Hartwell took a brief recess to consider the sentence. During those 30 minutes, Karen sat with her family in the hallway, trying to prepare herself for whatever decision would come. When court reconvened, the magistrate delivered her judgment with the measured tone of someone who had given careful thought to the appropriate consequences. "Mrs. Matthews, your actions on October 15th were serious, unprecedented, and completely unacceptable. Assault on a royal guard strikes at the heart of British tradition and security. However, I am taking into account your complete lack of prior criminal history, your genuine remorse, the unusual circumstances that led to your poor judgment, and the charitable statement from the victim himself." Karen held her breath as the magistrate continued. "I hereby sentence you to a fine of £2,000, 40 hours of community service to be completed here in London, and a requirement that you write a formal letter of apology to be included in palace records. Additionally, you will be placed on a 12-month suspended sentence, meaning that any further legal troubles during that period could result in additional penalties." The relief that washed over Karen was overwhelming. No jail time, no permanent criminal record if she stayed out of trouble. The financial penalty was significant but manageable, and the community service would actually give her a chance to make some positive contribution during her extended stay in London. Outside the courthouse, Margaret Thornton explained the terms of the sentence in more detail. The community service could be completed through various charitable organizations in London, and the suspended sentence meant that Karen would need to be extremely careful about her behavior for the next year. "You got off relatively lightly," Thornton explained. "The magistrate clearly believed in your remorse and took Guard Morrison's statement seriously. You're fortunate that he chose to speak on your behalf." As they walked away from the courthouse, Karen felt something she hadn't experienced in weeks, a small measure of hope. The legal proceedings were over, but now came the harder work of rebuilding her life and finding a way to live with the consequences of her actions. 6 months after the court hearing, Karen's life had taken on a rhythm she never could have imagined. She had completed her community service working with elderly residents at a care home in South London, an experience that had proven more transformative than any punishment could have been. The residents, many of whom remembered World War II and had deep connections to British history and tradition, had initially been skeptical of the American woman who had made international news for attacking a royal guard. But as Karen spent hours listening to their stories and helping with their daily activities, genuine relationships had formed. Mrs. Eleanor Wickham, a 93-year-old former nurse, became particularly close to Karen. She had worked during the London Blitz and had met members of the royal family during hospital visits in the 1940s. "You know, dear," Mrs. Wickham had said during one of their conversations, "we all make terrible mistakes. The measure of a person isn't whether they stumble, but whether they get back up and do better." Karen had written those words in the journal she had begun keeping during her extended stay in London. The journal had become a place where she processed her guilt, tracked her personal growth, and planned for an uncertain future. The formal letter of apology she had written to palace officials had been one of the most difficult documents she had ever composed. She had drafted it dozens of times, trying to find words that conveyed the depth of her remorse without sounding self-serving or making excuses. To His Royal Majesty, the palace administration, and most especially to Guard James Morrison, the final letter began, "I write to formally apologize for my unconscionable behavior on October 15th. When I assaulted Guard Morrison while he was performing his duties at Buckingham Palace." The letter went on to acknowledge the cultural significance of her actions, her understanding of the traditions she had violated, and her commitment to ensuring that such behavior never occurred again. She had also included details about her community service and the education she had gained about British history and customs. Guard Morrison had responded to her letter through official channels, accepting her apology and expressing his appreciation for the work she was doing to make amends. His response had been brief but gracious, wishing her well in rebuilding her life. The financial consequences of her extended stay in London had been severe. Karen had lost her job at the department store as expected, though her former boss had provided a positive reference acknowledging her years of good service prior to the incident. The family's savings had been depleted and they had taken on debt that would take years to repay. But there had been unexpected developments as well. A documentary filmmaker had approached Karen about telling her story as part of a broader examination of tourist behavior and cultural misunderstandings. The fee wouldn't solve their financial problems, but it would help, and Karen saw it as an opportunity to turn her experience into something educational. "I want people to understand that when you travel to another country, you're not just a tourist," she explained to the filmmaker during their interview. "You're a representative of your own culture, and you have a responsibility to respect the places and people you visit." I failed terribly in that responsibility. Emma had been forced to defer her plans for graduate school to help support the family financially during Karen's legal troubles, but she had found work with a non-profit organization that assisted Americans facing legal issues abroad. The experience had given her insights into international law and cultural competency that she might never have gained otherwise. Ruth had struggled the most with the aftermath of the incident. The stress had exacerbated her existing health conditions, and she continued to feel responsible for suggesting the trip that had led to such consequences. But she had also found strength in supporting her daughter through the worst period of her life. "I'm proud of how you've handled yourself since that awful day," she told Karen one evening as they sat in their small London apartment. "The person who bit that guard isn't the person you really are. I've watched you work to become better, and that takes real courage." The media attention had largely faded, though Karen's name still occasionally appeared in articles about tourist misbehavior or cultural insensitivity. She had learned to live with the knowledge that her worst moment would probably follow her for the rest of her life. But she was also learning that people could change their perception of her through her actions going forward. The care home where she had completed her community service had offered her a paid position helping coordinate activities for the residents. The work was meaningful and allowed her to stay in London while she figured out her next steps. She was considering pursuing formal training in elderly care or social services, fields where her experience with difficult situations and her newfound empathy could be assets. 1 year after the incident, Karen returned to Buckingham Palace for the first time since that terrible morning. She didn't approach the guards or try to interact with anyone official. She simply stood among the tourists, watching the changing of the guard ceremony, with a deep appreciation for the tradition and discipline she had once so carelessly disrupted. She noticed the guards' precise movements, their dedication to duty, and the respect shown by the watching crowds. She remembered her conversation with Mrs. Wickham about the history these guards represented and the sacrifices made by previous generations to preserve British traditions. As she watched, a tourist near her became frustrated with the crowds and raised his voice at a guard, demanding that he move so a photo could be taken. Karen found herself stepping forward, politely but firmly explaining to the tourist about the guard's duties and the importance of showing respect. "They're not here for our entertainment," she said quietly. "They're performing an important ceremonial duty that connects us to centuries of history. The least we can do is watch respectfully." The tourist, somewhat embarrassed by her gentle correction, apologized and stepped back. Karen realized that she had come full circle from the person who had assaulted a guard to someone who now defended their dignity and purpose. Walking away from the palace that day, Karen felt something she hadn't experienced in over a year: peace with herself. She would always carry the shame of what she had done, but she had also discovered strength and compassion she hadn't known she possessed. Her mother and Emma had returned to Ohio months earlier, but Karen had chosen to stay in London to continue her work and complete her transformation. She was building a new life based on service rather than entitlement, understanding rather than judgment, and humility rather than demands for attention. The woman who had bitten the royal guard was gone, replaced by someone who understood that true strength came from lifting others up, rather than tearing them down. It had been the most expensive lesson of her life, but it had also been the most valuable. As Karen walked through the streets of London toward her job at the care home, she thought about Mrs. Wickham's words about getting back up after stumbling. She had stumbled spectacularly, embarrassing herself and her family on an international stage. But she had also gotten back up and in doing so had discovered who she really wanted to be. The regret would always remain, but it no longer defined her. Instead, it had become the foundation for a better version of herself, one day of service at a time.